something unusual is happening in the American housing market. Not a small shift, not a normal seasonal slowdown. Something bigger. Across dozens of cities in the United States, sellers are quietly lowering their asking prices, and in many places, they are doing it again and again and again. Homes that once sold within days now sit on the market for weeks, sometimes months, and the numbers tell a story that's becoming harder to ignore. Price cuts are spreading across the country, but this didn't happen overnight. To understand what's happening now, we need to go back just a few years. Because not long ago, the U.S. housing market looked unstoppable. In 2020 and 2021, the housing market experienced one of the most dramatic booms in modern history. Mortgage rates fell to historic lows, in some cases dropping below 3%. For buyers, borrowing money had rarely been cheaper. At the same time, millions of Americans suddenly found themselves rethinking where they wanted to live. Remote work spread rapidly. Cities emptied. Suburbs and smaller towns surged in popularity. Demand exploded. Homes began selling within hours of listing. Buyers waived inspections. Bidding wars became normal. In cities like Austin, Phoenix, and Tampa, prices surged at astonishing speeds, sometimes rising more than 20% in a single year. For sellers, it felt like the perfect moment. List a house on Thursday. Accept offers by Sunday. Close above asking price. It seemed like the boom might never end. But housing markets move in cycles. They always have. And history quietly reminds us of that fact. To understand today's shift, many analysts are looking back to another moment in American housing history. The early 2000s. Back then, housing prices climbed rapidly across the country. Cheap credit and loose lending standards pushed demand higher and higher. At the time, many believed real estate prices could only move in one direction, up. But by 2006, cracks began to appear. Homes stayed on the market longer. Inventory started rising. And in some cities, sellers began quietly lowering prices. At first, it seemed small, temporary. But within 2 years, the situation turned into something much larger. The housing crash of 2008 would eventually become one of the most significant financial crises in modern history. Now, today's market is not identical to that moment. Mortgage standards are stricter. Homeowners generally hold more equity. Banks are more cautious. But markets don't need to repeat history exactly to echo some of its patterns. And one familiar signal is beginning to appear again. Price reductions. Across the United States, the number of homes with price cuts has been rising. In many major markets, a growing percentage of listings are now lowering their prices before selling. Sometimes by a few $1,000s. Other times by tens of thousands. For sellers who expected bidding wars, this is a shock. Because just 2 years ago, the power dynamic in housing looked completely different. Back then, buyers were competing for limited supply. Today, in some markets, sellers are competing for buyers. And that shift is changing behavior across the country. The first reason behind this change is simple. Interest rates. In 2022, the Federal Reserve began raising interest rates aggressively to fight inflation. Mortgage rates responded quickly. Within months, the average 30-year mortgage rate more than doubled compared to pandemic lows. For buyers, that single change had enormous consequences. A home that seemed affordable at a 3% mortgage suddenly became far more expensive at 7%. Monthly payments surged. Budgets shrank. And many buyers quietly stepped back from the market. Not because they didn't want a home, but because the math no longer worked. Imagine a buyer shopping for a $500,000 home in 2021. At a 3% mortgage rate, their monthly payment might have been manageable. But fast forward to today. With mortgage rates near 7%, that same house could require hundreds, sometimes over $1,000 more per month. For many families, that difference is simply too large. So buyers wait. They delay. Or they leave the market entirely. And when buyers disappear, sellers begin to feel it. At first, many sellers resisted the change. They remembered the boom years. They remembered neighbors selling above asking price. They remembered headlines about record-breaking home values. So when listing their homes, many owners priced aggressively. Sometimes based on last year's peak prices. Sometimes based on even higher expectations. But the market had already begun shifting. And buyers noticed. Homes began sitting longer. Open houses grew quieter. Offers arrived, but below asking price. For sellers, this created a difficult decision. Wait for the perfect buyer. Or lower the price. Across many cities, that decision is now happening every day. And increasingly, the answer is price cuts. But the story doesn't stop with interest rates. Another factor is quietly changing the housing landscape. Inventory. During the pandemic boom, housing supply was extremely tight. Few homeowners wanted to sell. Construction struggled to keep up. And demand far outpaced available homes. But now that balance is slowly shifting. More listings are appearing. Homes that didn't sell last season are returning to the market. Builders are completing projects started during the boom. And in some cities, supply is finally beginning to rise. When supply rises faster than demand, prices feel pressure. That's basic market economics. But housing markets are emotional as well as financial. And emotions are starting to change. In several fast-growing pandemic boom towns, the shift has been especially visible. Cities that saw explosive price growth during the pandemic are now facing some of the largest increases in price reductions. Why? Because those markets rose the fastest. And markets that rise quickly can sometimes cool just as quickly. Buyers in those areas are becoming cautious. Investors are stepping back. And sellers who expected easy profits are discovering a different reality. Yet it's important to understand something. Price cuts don't automatically mean a housing crash. In many cases, they simply reflect a market returning to balance. During the boom years, prices surged far faster than incomes. That gap was unlikely to last forever. Now the market may simply be adjusting. Slowly, unevenly, city by city. But even small adjustments can feel dramatic after years of rapid growth. And for many sellers, the change feels sudden. Consider a homeowner who watched their property value climb dramatically between 2020 and 2022. Perhaps their home gained $200,000 in estimated value. That kind of appreciation can shape expectations. So when they finally decide to sell, they price their home based on those peak numbers. But if the market has cooled since then, buyers may hesitate. Weeks pass. Showings slow down. And eventually, the listing agent suggests something that would have been unthinkable 2 years ago. Lower the price. For some sellers, the first price cut feels small. A minor adjustment. Maybe $5,000. But if the market remains quiet, another reduction may follow. Then another. In certain markets, listings now show multiple price drops before finally attracting a buyer. It's a subtle signal, but an important one, because widespread price reductions often indicate that expectations and reality are still adjusting. And that raises an important question. How far could this trend go? Are these price cuts simply a temporary reset, or the early stage of something larger? To answer that question, we need to look closer at the cities where this trend is accelerating fastest. Because in some parts of the country, the pressure is building much faster than in others. And the patterns emerging in those cities may offer clues about where the broader housing market could be heading next. That story begins in places where the pandemic housing boom was once at its strongest, and where the adjustments now appear to be happening the fastest. In the next part, we'll explore the U.S. cities where price cuts are spreading most rapidly, and what those local markets reveal about the future of American housing. Because the numbers coming out of those cities may surprise you, and they may change how many people see the housing market in the months ahead. To understand where the housing market may be heading, it helps to look at the places where the shift is happening fastest. Because the United States housing market is not one single market. It is hundreds of local markets, each moving at its own pace. Some cities remain relatively stable. Others are cooling slowly. But in a growing number of places, price cuts are accelerating. And many of those cities share something in common. They were the biggest winners of the pandemic housing boom. Take Austin, Texas. Just a few years ago, Austin became one of the most talked about housing markets in America. Tech companies expanded rapidly. New residents arrived from California and other high-cost states. Demand surged almost overnight. Between 2020 and 2022, home prices in the Austin metro area skyrocketed. Some neighborhoods saw values climb by more than 50% in a remarkably short time. Listings barely lasted a weekend. Buyers competed aggressively. Waiving inspections became routine. But rapid growth can sometimes create fragile conditions. Because when prices rise too far, too fast, the market can struggle to maintain that momentum. Today, Austin is seeing something very different. Homes are sitting longer. Inventory has increased. And sellers are making price reductions at a pace rarely seen during the boom years. For buyers, this creates new opportunities. For sellers, it creates new pressure. A similar pattern is appearing in Phoenix, Arizona. Phoenix experienced one of the most intense housing surges during the pandemic. Affordable compared to many coastal cities, the region attracted waves of remote workers and investors. Construction boomed. Developers rushed to meet demand. But once mortgage rates rose, the equation changed quickly. Suddenly, fewer buyers could afford the same homes. Inventory began to rise. And many sellers who expected quick sales found themselves waiting. In response, price reductions began appearing across listings. Sometimes small, sometimes significant. And while Phoenix remains a large and active housing market, the pace of growth has clearly slowed. Then there is Boise, Idaho. Boise became almost a symbol of the pandemic housing boom. Once considered a quiet and affordable city, it suddenly gained national attention as home prices soared. People moved in from across the country, drawn by outdoor lifestyles and lower costs of living. For a time, demand overwhelmed supply. But when mortgage rates climbed and affordability tightened, Boise faced a difficult adjustment. Because when prices rise quickly in smaller markets, affordability can disappear faster than expected. Today, Boise has seen a noticeable increase in price cuts and longer listing times. For sellers who bought at peak prices, the shift has been especially uncomfortable. Another city experiencing similar changes is Las Vegas, Nevada. Las Vegas has always had a housing market known for dramatic cycles. Booms followed by corrections. Rapid growth followed by cooling. During the pandemic years, Las Vegas home prices surged as buyers from California and other western states arrived. But like many fast-growing markets, the rise in mortgage rates slowed demand. Listings began to accumulate, and gradually, sellers began adjusting prices. In some neighborhoods, reductions became a common feature of online listings. But these shifts are not limited to the western United States. In parts of the Southeast, similar patterns are emerging. Consider Tampa, Florida. Tampa experienced extraordinary housing demand during the pandemic migration wave. Florida's tax advantages, warm climate, and growing job market made it one of the most attractive destinations in the country. Prices climbed rapidly. Investors entered the market. Short-term rental demand increased. But as borrowing costs climbed, the pool of buyers narrowed. Today, Tampa remains active, but sellers are increasingly adjusting expectations. Price reductions have become more common as homes compete for a smaller group of qualified buyers. Even Nashville, Tennessee, a city known for strong economic growth and cultural popularity, has seen subtle signs of cooling. Nashville's housing market surged as remote workers and new residents arrived from across the country. Construction accelerated. New neighborhoods expanded outward from the city center. But like many other booming markets, affordability eventually reached its limits. As mortgage rates rose, buyers became more selective. And some sellers have begun lowering prices to attract attention in a more cautious market. These cities reveal something important. The housing market shift is not random. It tends to appear first in the places where prices rose the fastest. When rapid appreciation meets higher borrowing costs, the result can be a sudden slowdown. Buyers pause, inventory builds, and price cuts begin appearing across listings. But there is another factor quietly influencing today's housing market: investor behavior. During the pandemic boom, real estate investors played a significant role in many cities. Low interest rates made financing attractive. Rental demand appeared strong. And rapid home price appreciation created the possibility of quick profits. In some markets, investors purchased large numbers of homes, sometimes as long-term rentals, sometimes as short-term vacation properties, sometimes simply as speculative investments. But when borrowing costs rise and price growth slows, investment strategies can change. Some investors hold their properties. Others begin selling. And when investor-owned homes return to the market, inventory increases. That additional supply can contribute to the growing number of listings with price cuts. Another element shaping the market is buyer psychology. Housing markets are influenced not just by numbers, but by expectations. When buyers believe prices will rise quickly, they often rush to purchase before costs increase further. But when the market appears uncertain, behavior can shift. Buyers slow down. They negotiate harder. They wait for better deals. In some cases, they simply step aside and watch. That hesitation alone can create pressure on sellers. Because when demand softens, even slightly, pricing power begins to change. Real estate agents across several markets have described similar conversations with sellers. Homeowners who expected immediate offers now face a different reality. Agents suggest adjusting the price, improving the listing presentation, or offering buyer incentives. In some cases, sellers respond quickly. In others, they resist at first. But the longer a home sits unsold, the more pressure builds to make a change. And increasingly, that change appears in the form of a price reduction. Yet even as price cuts increase in certain cities, the broader housing market remains complex. In some regions, inventory is still relatively limited. In others, strong job markets continue supporting demand. This is why national housing trends can sometimes appear confusing. Because the market is not moving in a single direction everywhere. Some cities are cooling quickly. Others are simply stabilizing after years of rapid growth. But one thing is becoming increasingly clear. The era of effortless home sales may be fading, at least for now. And as sellers adjust their expectations, another question is quietly emerging. What happens next? Will price cuts continue spreading across more cities? Will buyers eventually return if mortgage rates fall? Or could the market settle into a slower, more balanced phase for several years? Those answers may depend on forces that extend far beyond individual cities. Interest rates, economic growth, population shifts, and the long-term shortage of housing in many parts of the country. All of these factors will shape the next chapter of the American housing market. But before looking ahead, there is one more important piece of the story. Because behind every statistic, every price reduction, and every unsold listing, there are real homeowners making difficult decisions. And those decisions are beginning to reshape the housing market in ways that may not yet be fully visible. In the next part, we'll explore the psychology of sellers facing a changing market and why desperation can sometimes appear faster than anyone expects. Because when expectations collide with reality, the housing market can change direction very quickly. And that moment may already be unfolding in more places than many people realize. A homeowner who expected a quick sale. A listing agent watching the days on market slowly climb. A family waiting for offers that never quite arrive. Housing statistics often appear as charts and percentages, but in reality, each number reflects a decision made by someone navigating an uncertain market. And in today's housing environment, those decisions are becoming more difficult. Because expectations formed during the boom years are now colliding with a very different reality. For many homeowners, the idea of selling their property was once simple. During the peak of the housing surge, selling a home often required very little effort. List the house. Schedule an open house. Review multiple offers. In many cases, buyers competed fiercely. Homes sold above asking price. Cash offers appeared frequently. Negotiations favored the seller. It created a powerful impression. The belief that housing demand would remain endlessly strong. But housing markets rarely behave that way forever. And when conditions shift, expectations can take time to adjust. Consider a homeowner who watched property values climb dramatically between 2020 and 2022. Online estimates showed the home gaining value month after month. Neighbors sold their homes at record prices. Local news reported housing shortages and bidding wars. All of this shaped a simple belief. If they ever decided to sell, buyers would appear instantly. But when many of these homeowners list their homes today, the response can be quieter. Showings arrive slowly. Open houses feel calm rather than crowded. Weeks pass without offers. For some sellers, the experience feels confusing. What changed? The answer often comes down to affordability. Housing demand did not disappear entirely, but higher mortgage rates dramatically changed what buyers can afford. A family that could comfortably purchase a home 2 years ago may now face much higher monthly payments, even if the home price stayed exactly the same. This forces buyers to make adjustments. They search for smaller homes. They move farther from city centers, or they pause their search altogether. And when buyers hesitate, sellers begin to notice. At first, many sellers respond with patience. They wait a few weeks. Perhaps the right buyer simply hasn't seen the listing yet. But real estate markets move quickly. If a home sits on the market too long, buyers begin to wonder why. Is the price too high? Is something wrong with the property? Even if the home itself is perfectly fine, perception can shift. That is when listing agents often recommend the first price adjustment. The first price cut is usually cautious. A small reduction, just enough to refresh the listing and attract new attention. Sometimes it works. More buyers schedule showings. Offers appear. But in slower markets, even that adjustment may not be enough. And when another few weeks pass without serious offers, a second price cut may follow. This pattern is becoming increasingly common in certain cities. Real estate agents sometimes describe this moment as the turning point in a listing. Because the longer a home stays unsold, the more urgency begins to build. Sellers start reconsidering their plans. Maybe they already purchased another home. Maybe they are relocating for work. Maybe they expected the sale proceeds to fund another investment. When those plans depend on a quick sale, time suddenly matters. And time pressure can change pricing decisions very quickly. In many cases, sellers eventually face a difficult question. Hold out for the original price, or accept the market's new reality. For some homeowners, the answer is simple. They adjust the price quickly and move forward. But for others, the emotional attachment to peak prices can make that decision harder. After all, no one likes the feeling of selling for less than what the market once promised. This psychological element has always played a role in housing markets. Economists sometimes refer to it as price anchoring. When homeowners see a certain value attached to their property, that number becomes fixed in their minds, even if the market begins shifting. But buyers do not share the same anchor. They look at current mortgage rates, current inventory, current comparable sales, and if those numbers point to lower values, they simply wait. That gap between seller expectations and buyer willingness is where price cuts often begin. There is also another group of sellers facing difficult decisions. Investors. During the pandemic housing boom, investors purchased homes across many markets. Some planned to rent them. Others hoped for continued price appreciation. As long as prices kept rising, the strategy seemed safe. But slower growth and higher borrowing costs can complicate that plan. Rental income may not cover higher financing costs. Home values may no longer rise fast enough to justify holding the property. In those situations, investors sometimes decide to sell. And when multiple investors sell in the same market, competition increases. That added supply can lead to more price reductions. Builders are also adjusting their strategies. During the boom years, home builders rushed to meet surging demand. Construction projects launched across suburban areas and growing cities. But home construction operates on long timelines. Homes started 2 years ago are often being completed today, which means new supply is still entering the market. To keep sales moving, some builders are offering incentives, mortgage rate buydowns, closing cost assistance, upgraded features. In some cases, builders are even lowering base prices. These incentives can place additional pressure on existing homeowners trying to sell nearby properties. All of these forces create a market environment that feels very different from the recent past. For buyers, it may finally offer negotiating power. For sellers, it introduces uncertainty. And uncertainty often spreads quietly through housing markets. Because once price cuts begin appearing across multiple listings, other sellers take notice. They watch nearby homes reduce prices. They see similar properties staying on the market longer. And slowly, expectations begin to shift. This is how housing markets often change direction. Not through a single, dramatic moment, but through hundreds of small adjustments. One seller lowers the price, then another, then another. Over time, those decisions accumulate, gradually reshaping the entire market. Yet even as price reductions spread in certain areas, the future of the housing market remains uncertain. Because several powerful forces are still supporting home prices in many parts of the country. Housing supply remains historically limited in many regions. Millions of homeowners locked in extremely low mortgage rates during the pandemic. And many of them are reluctant to sell. That reluctance keeps inventory from rising too quickly, which prevents prices from falling rapidly in many markets. So the housing market today exists in a strange balance. Pressure in some cities, stability in others. And that leads to the biggest question of all. Where does the housing market go from here? Will price cuts continue spreading across the country? Will mortgage rates eventually fall, bringing buyers back? Or could the market settle into a slower period of adjustment that lasts for several years? To answer those questions, we need to look at the bigger picture. The forces shaping housing demand, the long-term supply shortage, and the economic trends that may determine whether today's price cuts become something temporary or something far more significant. In the final part, we'll explore what the future of the U.S. housing market may look like if current trends continue. Because the next phase of this story could affect millions of homeowners, buyers, and investors across the country. And the outcome may not be as simple as many people expect. At this point, one question hangs over the entire housing market. Where does it go from here? Are these growing price cuts simply a short-term adjustment, or the early signal of a much larger shift? The answer may depend on several powerful forces that are still shaping the housing market today. And the most important of them is interest rates. For decades, mortgage rates have played a central role in the rhythm of the American housing market. When rates fall, borrowing becomes cheaper. Buyers gain purchasing power. Demand increases. Prices often follow. But when rates rise, the opposite tends to happen. Monthly payments increase. Affordability shrinks. And the pool of potential buyers becomes smaller. That is exactly what the market has been experiencing over the past 2 years. Mortgage rates that once hovered near historic lows have climbed dramatically. And even small changes in rates can reshape housing affordability. Because a home purchase is rarely just about the price of the property. It is about the monthly payment. And when that payment rises significantly, many buyers step back and reconsider. But interest rates are not the only factor influencing what happens next. Another powerful force lies beneath the surface of the housing market. Supply. For years, the United States has struggled with a shortage of housing. Following the housing crash of 2008, home construction slowed dramatically. Many builders left the industry. Financing for new projects became more difficult. And for nearly a decade, the country built fewer homes than population growth required. By the late 2010s, analysts were already warning that the nation faced a structural housing shortage. Millions of homes were simply missing from the market. That shortage became even more visible during the pandemic boom. Demand surged, inventory vanished, and prices climbed rapidly as buyers competed for limited supply. Even today, that shortage has not completely disappeared, which is one reason housing prices have not collapsed across most of the country. Instead, the market is adjusting slowly, unevenly, one city at a time. There is also another factor shaping the market: demographics. The largest generation in American history, the millennials, is now entering its prime home-buying years. Millions of people in their late 20s and 30s are still looking for their first homes. Many delayed buying during the pandemic surge. Others were priced out entirely. But the desire for homeownership remains strong. Over time, this demographic pressure could support housing demand, even if conditions remain difficult. Yet the housing market also faces real challenges. Affordability is one of the biggest. In many parts of the country, home prices have risen far faster than wages. Even before mortgage rates increased, many buyers were already stretching their budgets. Now, with higher borrowing costs, that gap has grown wider, which means the market may require time to rebalance. Sometimes that rebalancing happens through slower price growth, sometimes through flat prices, and sometimes through price cuts like the ones appearing today. But housing markets rarely move in straight lines. They move through phases: boom, slowdown, stabilization, and eventually recovery. The current moment may simply represent the transition between those phases, a period where sellers are adjusting expectations, buyers are recalculating budgets, and the market is searching for a new balance. For some sellers, this adjustment can feel uncomfortable, especially those who bought recently at higher prices, or those who expected to sell quickly. But for many buyers, this moment may represent the first return of negotiating power in years. Price reductions can create opportunities. Homes that once attracted bidding wars may now allow inspections, negotiations, and time to think. That shift alone marks a significant change from the frenzy of the pandemic housing boom. Real estate markets are often shaped by emotion as much as economics. When confidence is high, buyers rush in. When uncertainty grows, caution spreads. Right now, the housing market appears to be entering a more cautious phase. Not necessarily a collapse, but a cooling. A moment where expectations are being reset. And yet, one important truth remains. Housing is not just an investment. It is shelter. It is where families live, grow, and build their lives. Because of that, housing demand rarely disappears completely. It simply changes pace, sometimes accelerating rapidly, sometimes slowing down, but always moving forward. The current wave of price cuts reflects that shift in pace. A market that was once overheated is beginning to cool. Sellers who once held all the power are learning to compete again. And buyers who once rushed into bidding wars are taking a more careful approach. None of this happens overnight. Housing markets move slowly, but the signals are becoming clearer. Across many U.S. cities, price cuts are no longer rare. They are becoming part of the landscape. So the next time you scroll through home listings and notice those small price reductions, $5,000 here, $10,000 there, remember what they represent. Not just a number on a screen, but a quiet shift in the balance of the housing market. A signal that the extraordinary conditions of the past few years may finally be fading, and that the next chapter of the American housing story is already beginning. Because in real estate, the most important changes rarely arrive with loud headlines. They begin quietly, one listing at a time, one price cut at a time, until suddenly, everyone realizes the market has changed, and that change may already be underway.